Okay, so in this video, I am just going to talk about my love of Battletech and really my personal story of Battletech because Battletech is a very personal thing to me. It's kind of a major part of my childhood. It's one of the things that I'm overall most nostalgic for, even to this day. And so I kind of want to just, for fun, tell the story from my perspective of how Battletech kind of evolved personally throughout the years of my life. What were the major Battletech milestones? What pieces of Battletech were most relevant to me as I grew up? And it really all started with MechWarrior 1 and then with the Battletech Technical Readout 3025. So this is going to be a multi-part series, and in part 1 I'm going to be talking about those things, and then we'll go from there. My very first exposure to Battletech was with the 1989 MechWarrior game. This is the very first time that I was ever exposed to Battletech as a child, and I actually think it was around 1990 where I actually played the game. Just around a year before I moved from Toronto to Regina, Saskatchewan, which is where I, really grew up. And I remember we had, the old PC with MS-DOS installed, and I have fond nostalgic memories for a lot of the PC games that I played. Now, MechWarrior was one of those games that I really played quite a lot of and never actually completed the game until much, much later. There are some tricks really to doing well in the game, and getting the hang of piloting a mech was tough for 8-year-old me to master. Although I think I made it a fair way into the game, I never made it, all the way to the end of the game. That said, I wasn't really missing much. The game is sort of a continuous open world type experience where essentially you are doing rinse and repeat missions. Essentially every mission is more or less one of scout the base, destroy a base, or defeat an enemy lance of mechs. And there's really not much variety in the gameplay. It was good for the time, but it doesn't really change much. There's nothing new or interesting that happens really when you progress the story. It's essentially just text. You get to read the story of you coming across a certain mercenary company and so on and so forth. I won't spoil the story if you ever want to play the game. But as far as the missions go, there's nothing special in store for you. Right up to the very last mission of the game, you're essentially just doing the same thing over and over. You are essentially a mech warrior who is in charge of a company of mercenaries. And you need to manage your finances. You need to travel around the inner sphere, taking on contracts, repairing your mechs, the whole deal. Just like with the very recent MechWarrior 5 game. Really, MechWarrior 5 and the original MechWarrior are very, very, very similar games. A lot of people would also have played MechWarrior 2 Mercenaries. A lot of very similar themes going on there. Later MechWarrior games took on more of a linear storyline, but a lot of them still have this mercenaries aspect because it's very intriguing to not just be sent on missions as a member of a military force working for, say, one of the inner sphere armies or one of the peripheral armies or as a member of the clans, but having to manage your own company. And really the very first MechWarrior game captured this, and it was really a very good game for its time, not perfect, but I certainly found it intriguing as a child. Now, piloting mechs back then was tricky. It was really very different from first-person shooters, and it was not as well refined as even in MechWarrior 2 because you didn't have mouse look back then. really, it was all on the keyboard. You had some keys to rotate your torso, to aim your weapons up and down, to turn your mech, to go back and forward, but you didn't have a mouse, so precision aiming was quite difficult. Nonetheless, it was an entertaining game, and actually what I liked the most about it was, no surprise here, the giant robots themselves. You see, just the very concept of standing tanks, gigantic robots that were piloted by human pilots, was just fascinating to me as a kid. I hadn't been exposed to actually the inspiration and source material for Battletech. It wasn't until years later that I even heard the word Battletech, let alone Robotech, let alone things like Macross, which is what Robotech was based on, and which was in turn what Battletech was based on. Yeah, I wasn't aware of any of that. My first exposure to giant piloted machines, standing tanks, if you will, or as my 7-year-old son likes to say, giant robots, was this game, the MechWarrior 1. And if I think back, what really captured my imagination wasn't so much the gameplay, although certainly I enjoyed the gameplay, but rather it was the instruction manual, and in particular, the illustrations that accompanied the instruction manual. I remember flipping through the pages of that black and white instruction manual for MechWarrior and just having my imagination run wild about this world that they had created. And the illustrations of the mechs themselves were just absolutely captivating. And the illustrations that were in this manual were, for the most part, done by an artist by the name of Dwayne Luce. And these illustrations are, in fact, the same illustrations that accompanied the Battletech Technical Readout 3025, which I will talk about later on and probably do a whole video about. But these illustrations are really the most famous illustrations in Battletech. I obviously didn't know that at the time, but it speaks to just how great these illustrations were, how unique they were, how captivating they were, that I was so intrigued by them as a kid. And there's a whole story behind these illustrations and how they were, for the most part, lifted from Japanese anime, and that was very much so the case in terms of the mechs in MechWarrior, because the mechs in MechWarrior were, for the most part, with one exception, that being the Jenner, they were unseen. Of course, they weren't unseen at the time, but they are now within that bucket of mechs that had that whole legal trouble surrounding it, and that's a story for another day. But they were inspired by Japanese anime, so they were really cool robot designs to begin with. And then they had this art book sketch style to them, which really left a lot of room in my young mind for imagination to expand. And then slowly, I also picked up a little bit of the lore. I thought it was a really cool world. And bear in mind that, as far as I knew, it had all just been, for this one game, right? It was like Sylphied, which was another DOS game that had a manual with some cool illustrations in it. But that was a one-off. Well, I thought that this was a one-off. I couldn't have been more wrong, but I didn't realize that this was a franchise game. So it had a big impact on me. And I always wondered what it would be like if there was more to it, if there were more different mechs, how I would expand the game. From an early age, I always thought about how to extend my favorite things, how they could be expanded upon. Now, little did I know that my dream would essentially come true a few years later, and I'll get to that in a second. And I'll never be as nostalgic for any mech design as I am for the mech designs that were featured in this first MechWarrior game. The mechs that were in the original MechWarrior game were the Locust, the Jenner, the Phoenix Hawk, the Shadow Hawk, the Rifleman, the Warhammer, the Marauder, and the Battlemaster. And as a matter of fact, these are some of the most classic mech designs that exist. They're as classic as they come, and old school Battletech fans will be nostalgic for essentially all of these designs. But in particular, the Warhammer, then the Marauder, were in particular two designs that are really, really stand out as being cornerstone mech designs from the early days. Just about anybody that was playing Battletech or playing MechWarrior games back in the day will tell you that they are nostalgic for these mech designs. Everybody knows the Warhammer, everybody knows the Marauder, so on and so forth. The Phoenix Hawk, the Shadow Hawk, still very nostalgic mech designs, maybe less so. They did not appear in later MechWarrior games, as far as I know, right up until MechWarrior Online, which is when they first made their reappearance, and now they're back in more recent games. But of course, they look slightly different now than they did back then. Although the Shadow Hawk is still quite recognizable, the Phoenix Hawk really looks very different than it did back in the day. Now, of all the mechs that were in the original MechWarrior game, the one exception to the rule as far as being unseen was the Jenner, which is one of the most classic of the original Battletech designs that wasn't based on Robotech. It was an original design and a very good one. Most of the mechs from the early days in Battletech weren't really all that aesthetically appealing. They just didn't look as good as the ones that were ripped off of Japanese anime. But there were a few exceptions, the Jenner being one of them. Another notable exception would be the Atlas, which is another very classic mech design, which unfortunately was not in the original MechWarrior game. I kind of feel that it should have been. The Atlas, in fact, didn't appear at all until MechWarrior 2 Mercenaries, and even then it didn't really look like the real Atlas. That real Atlas didn't show up until later games. And so that was my first exposure to Battletech. Now, my second exposure to Battletech came much later, several years later, after we had moved from Toronto to Regina, Saskatchewan. And my father and I ended up going to a game and hobby store. Now, this is not, it wasn't a Games Workshop or anything like that. It was just a local game and hobby store. And I think that, I mean, it's definitely closed down years and years ago. I don't know if it moved locations or whatever it was, but I have no idea the name of the place. I just know that it had a lot of the kind of classic gaming systems, and it was probably the only store of its kind that at least that I'm aware of that existed in Regina, Saskatchewan at the time. I mean, I think the reason why my dad and I went there was because my dad wanted to purchase materials for his on and off hobby, which is model shipbuilding. He builds model ships, sometimes model, tanks or automobiles or aircraft, that kind of thing. He's a military enthusiast to a greater degree than myself, although I'm interested in that stuff too. But I've never taken up modeling as a hobby. For him, it's an off and on hobby. He'll go for years without being bothered with it, and then he'll get bored and he'll purchase a model ship and he'll go and build it. So he was probably buying modeling supplies. So that's probably why we went to the shop to begin with. And being a games and hobby store, they of course had model equipment, but I think that they also had a variety of miniatures for tabletop gaming. For sure, they had a lot of Warhammer 40K. That was big, and that would have been my earliest exposure to Warhammer, of which I also became very intrigued, and it sparked my imagination for that too. And I have a huge love for Warhammer that definitely begun when we went in that model store on that fateful day. And I remember that they had source materials for that as well. But alongside of that, and alongside, they had Dungeons and Dragons and various, other kind of role-playing games. And remember that role-playing games were not as mainstream then as they are now. So this was definitely a niche thing back then. It still is. But alongside that, they had Battletech. They had Battletech miniatures, and they had Battletech source books, including the technical readout 3025. And that was what really captured my imagination. I mean, there were many other things that did as well, but my mind was blown, and I wanted to stay in that store, and I remember I didn't want to leave. And I can't remember whether we purchased it on that day or whether it was at a later occasion. I begged to go back, but we did end up purchasing the technical readout 3025. I convinced my dad to buy it for me. But I remember flipping through the pages of it in the store. And just the light bulbs were going off in my head. It was this huge revelation that something that I really had previously thought was just a computer game, a one-off computer game, I realized was not. It was based off of this tabletop system, and there were novels already coming out. I noticed that there were novels, and there was all kinds of source materials, and there was the boxed game, and there was this technical readout. And the technical readout is what really captured my imagination, because as I looked at even the front cover, I noticed immediately the Marauder, which is of course one of the most iconic mechs in Battletech, and it was also of course featured in the first MechWarrior game. So I recognized it immediately, and it is one of the most intriguing mechs. It's one of the ones with the best artwork. I remember looking at it and just thinking there was something special about it, even among the lineup of the mechs, of the other great unseen mechs that were featured in the first MechWarrior game. The Marauder really stood out. It's a fantastic design, and it's based, of course, it's lifted directly from Macross. But of course, I still didn't know that even at this time, nor did I recognize its Japanese-ness. I just thought it was incredibly cool, and it just had this mystique about it. So I noticed the Marauder, and I began flipping through the pages of this manual. And for sure, I'm going to do a separate video just about this technical readout, because it's one of the most. It was just definitely a cornerstone in terms of my love for this franchise. But I flipped through the pages, and all of the art essentially had the same sketchbook style that I loved so much from the instruction manual for MechWarrior, and they were in fact the same illustrations. And the very first mech that you open the book up to was the Locust, and it's the same illustration as from the instruction manual. So I knew I was onto something. My mind was blown. I just loved it, and then it was like this whole new world, because I had thought that they just, put these few mechs together, and it just seemed like there was so much potential for more. Like I wanted more. I had always wanted more mechs. I'd imagined it previously, and here they were. There were more mechs, and it all kinds of variation abounded, and there, the Battletech technical readout, of course, it had the unseen, and there was a whole bunch of unseen designs that were based off of Japanese anime. That they looked fantastic, and not only that, but it was accompanied by all this lore. And again, I don't want to spend too long in this video talking about the technical readout itself, but you got to understand that everything was right here, because you had the lore of the world laid out, probably more so in what is essentially just a listing of different battle mech designs, right? Like, what weapons do they have? How fast do they go? Can they jump? How much armor do they have? But accompanying that on every page was all this lore, this incredible amount of lore. You had notable mech warriors, you had notable, deployments and engagements that the mechs had been involved in. You had its background behind how it had been produced, its history, whether it was, Star League era or Succession War era or whatever the case may be, how rare it is, some of the quirkiness of the different designs, which for the most part at that time were only for flavor, because mechs didn't have, perks or quirks or anything. They just hadn't been worked into the game system at that time. The game system was just, tier one tech, very basic set of rules compared to now. Not that it was really basic, but it was basic compared to now. But it had all this flavor and all this lore, about all the succession states, all of the the great houses. It was all packed into these pages. You didn't even need to read the core rule book or the core lore book or any of these other source materials. A lot of the lore was right here. And it was accompanying these illustrations, which, like I said, just absolutely loved them. They were all by Dwayne Luce, very, very consistent with one another. And I still kind of prefer this art style for Battletech, probably due to nostalgia, but I prefer this art style better than any of the more recent art styles. The Battletech designs themselves, for the most part, are not very good looking, with the exception of the Unseen and a handful of non-Unseen designs that look good. A lot of the mechs kind of look like, tin cans. They look terrible, like the original designs, the ones that aren't based off of anime. But in some ways that made the Unseen mechs look all the better by comparison, which it kind of, it worked, right? Some of the mechs look really clunky and basic, and other ones look beautiful, and that was cool in a way. Now I find newer designs all look alike. They have a very, modern Battletech look to them. There's just not a lot of mechs that really break the modern mold anymore. So I'm nostalgic for that, for just so many reasons in terms of this technical readout.
And I'm sure this is going to sound nerdy, but I mean, this is a video about Battletech, so I think we're already over that hump a long time ago. But I just really enjoy reading technical specifications about war machines, and other related type stuff. It doesn't matter whether we're talking about, real or fictional. I really enjoy poring over, historical readouts of, tank designs from World War II. I'm a big World War II tank nut, with all the German, tank designs, and the Russian and the French, British, American tank designs that were used in World War II. Ship designs, naval ships, aircraft, both historical and modern, as well as fictional. And we could be talking about spaceships, like big into Star Trek, and, even used to enjoy Star Wars, and then so on and so forth. And it's even better if there's an internal consistency to the world, which, Star Trek obviously doesn't have. It's random. But with Battletech, the really cool thing is that every single mech design that was presented was built according to rules in the game. There are legal designs and there are non-legal designs. And frankly, I don't actually think there's a whole lot of game systems that are like that. Battletech has very, very strict, clear rules as to how the mechs are built. And that, before I ever read the rules of how you design a mech, which I did, eventually. I bought core rule books and all kinds of stuff. I'll get into that in a later video. But it's really shown through in the technical readout. Every mech came with advantages and disadvantages, and there was this consistency about it. And at that time, there were no perks or quirks that bend the internal consistency just a little bit but add flavor, which I'm all in favor of. But at the time, there wasn't. And with the 3025 rule set, it was a very, very basic, very clear-cut and streamlined kind of world that they were giving you in terms of what a mech was and what it wasn't, which I think made it more consumable. And it sort of triggered the imagination, because I always thought, what if you could do more with this? What if there were mechs with special abilities and so on and so forth? And then eventually they introduced some of those concepts in later versions of the game.
So yeah, I mean, suffices to say, I enjoyed the technical readout immensely. And I still have it. It's not in very good condition, but it's still one of my more prized possessions, I suppose. Yeah. And so I took the Battletech technical readout home and I just consumed it. I've flipped through the pages so many times over the years, and I did, I eventually bought the board game, never really found anyone to play it with. Ended up, buying, until years and years later in online format. So I've still never really used the physical copy of the board game that I purchased, although I'm familiar with the rules. And I ended up buying some other source materials, reading a few of the novels, but nothing ever captured my imagination quite the same as the original technical readout 3025. So that's basically the story of how I was really introduced to Battletech, and how Battletech really was a major part of my formative years. It didn't just make a big impression on me. I mean, it's embedded in my soul, just because I was really exposed to it at such an early age in the form of MechWarrior 1. So because of MechWarrior 1, the concept was introduced. I had that idea implanted in my mind of, what a mech is, right? When you're a kid, you're introduced to concepts, and no concept is ever as sort of codified in your brain as concepts that you're introduced to as a child. There are numerous psychological studies that demonstrate this. So as a child, you're introduced to farm animals, right? You're introduced to what a cat is, what a dog is, what a cow, what a pig is. You're introduced to concepts like cars, airplanes, tanks, houses. These sort of very mutable objects in your mind. And the earlier you're exposed to something, the more it's really kind of part of who you are. And then concepts that you're introduced to later can definitely spark the imagination in various ways, but they're never as kind of fundamental to your understanding of the world, fictional or not. I mean, I was introduced to Battletech when I was 7 years old in 1989 when MechWarrior 1 came out. Battletech is part of who I am. And so I was introduced to it with MechWarrior, and then really I was introduced to the world of Battletech, not just the concept. The MechWarrior game introduced me to the concept, but the world was introduced to me via technical readout 3025 and the other kind of source materials and so on and so forth that surrounded it. But really it was Battletech technical readout 3025. Those two things were really the most important things to me when it came to establishing the idea in my mind of what Battletech is. And they're the most important things that, when it comes to my own personal story of Battletech. Now, for the next few years, I would still go back to that hobby and game store. I would go back there and I would acquire a huge interest and a love of Warhammer 40,000. I'd be introduced to Dungeons and Dragons, although not to the same extent. And I would continue to be interested in Battletech. And, there were other kinds of source materials. There was Technical Readout 2750. There was the Battletech, board game, like I mentioned, and some novels and so on and so forth. But the next big thing that would hit would be the Clan Invasion a few years later. And that was introduced to me during with Technical Readout 3050. And that is what I will pick up with in the next video.